Welcome to the Interlocutor podcast. I'm Tyrell Cameron Eskilson. My guest today is Frank Furedi. Frank was born in Hungary, grew up in Canada, and has lived and worked in England as a sociologist for over 40 years. He's also a prolific author of books ranging from academic freedom to identity, why borders matter, problems with education, and paranoid parenting. The topic of our discussion today is Frank's recent book, which is called The War Against the Past: Why the West Must Fight for Its History. Frank, thanks very much for joining me today.
Pleasure. Nice to talk to you.
I'm interested in starting with your background in Hungary. I'm wondering about where in Hungary your family comes from and maybe what your parents or grandparents did in Hungary, and what were the circumstances that led to you and your family moving to Canada in the 1950s?
Well, I grew up in Budapest, and then the revolution broke out in 1956 against the Soviet occupiers. And my father and my sister were very active in it. I was only 9 at the time. And when the revolution was crushed, then we had to flee because of my father's involvement. So we fled to Austria and eventually ended up in Canada, where I kind of grew up. Went to university there and eventually went to England to do my PhD in 1969.
What led to your decision to study the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya?
I was really interested in the colonial struggles that were very recent, even then, at that point in time. I was fascinated by African history, and I decided that that's a topic that wasn't really explored in a scholarly kind of a way. So I took the opportunity to immerse myself in a totally different culture, just to get an idea of how you go about doing research, field work. And that was really an intensely exciting experience of going to Kenya and talking to the Mau Mau fighters. And my first book eventually was the thesis.
How does a sociologist approach fieldwork like that compared to, say, an anthropologist?
I think it's very similar to anthropologists. I think maybe we have a slightly bigger picture because, I wasn't really that interested in the kinship structures or the way in which a particular village was organized. I was more interested in the kind of life and the cultural dynamics within the village where I worked. And in particular, my research question was to discover why people took up arms against the British colonial rule.
I didn't know anything about the Mau Mau uprising until really recently. I happened to watch Jeremy Paxman's documentary on the British Empire, and he mentioned it. I also found it interesting that when the British wanted to build a railroad from Mombasa to Nairobi, that they brought workers from India over to Kenya, and that those families and their descendants lived in Kenya until independence, and then according to the documentary, many of them ended up moving to places like Leicester in England, which would have been just a few years before you moved to England.
Yes, basically what happened was that they relied on cheap Asian labor to build the infrastructure of the colonies. And many of these Asian migrants to Kenya did really well, economically. And there's a lot of hostility and resentment against them by the Africans when independence came. So many of them felt they had to get out of there, and most of them ended up living in England.
Your most recent book that we're going to discuss today, The War Against the Past, you recently had a book launch event scheduled at a bookstore, and that got... the first venue got canceled. Could you explain a little bit about what happened with that?
Well, we had organized a book launch in Brussels in a nice bookshop, the Wine Bar, and everything was arranged. And I think what happened was that when the media got hold of the fact that this was going to happen, they and some of the local politicians who don't like my politics put a lot of pressure on the bookshop to cancel the book launch. And I was shocked because bookshops are bookshops. They're meant to be spaces where you discuss different kind of books. It's not exactly a high-profile political event, but there is a very, what they call cancel culture in America. It's got a very strong presence within Belgium and Brussels, and therefore I wasn't totally surprised by what happened. Unfortunately, my friends and I had an alternative plan that if something happened, we had another venue where we could have the book launch, which we had yesterday, and that was very successful.
Yeah, I happened to watch the recording of it. It looked like a good event. So I want to start with the title of your book, The War Against the Past, and maybe start by talking about two words, war and past, and then maybe as we get to the end of our conversation, we could end with the subtitle, Why the West Must Fight for Its History. So let's begin with your use of the term war and how you say in the book it's not entirely a metaphorical usage. Could you explain what you meant by that?
Well, what's very interesting, and that's why I wrote the book, is because so much of what people call the culture war targets the past and tries to represent the past as toxic, as a story of shame that we need to break away from, make a rupture with what has gone on beforehand. And one of the things that I was very disturbed by is that what's taking place is not simply the rewriting of history, revising what happened, which is all right. Every generation rewrites history. But what you have is a systematic attempt to annihilate the past. That everything that was important in terms of the historical legacy of Europe or Western civilization is cast in a very negative mold. And every hero of mine, every individual who's been great in terms of philosophy or culture or music or the arts, are now kind of represented as members of white supremacy. They're meant to be racist. They kind of almost kind of suggested there is a kind of original sin that goes all the way back to ancient Greece, for which we always bear responsibility, and nothing that comes out of Europe is of any merit. And therefore, what we should do is basically attack it and destroy that whole understanding that we have of where we've come from. And the systematic way in which this is conducted, this kind of campaign is conducted, resembles a kind of cultural war, which is why I use the war fairly carefully. And the members of the movement that are behind it almost operate like as if they're kind of militant soldiers, sort of hunting for new targets to attack.
And the term the past and how we understand what the past is, this is also important to all the subsequent chapters in the book, whether it's the year zero ideology or terms like presentism, anachronism, even what I found was fascinating, how you describe Erik Erikson's research and how identity crises can even result from detachments from the past. So the past as a distinct temporal realm and as a cultural accomplishment, our sense of the past. How did that develop beginning in the Renaissance period, or what was special about the Renaissance period? And as we bring that forward to, say, the past 50, 60 years or so, how have the cultural warriors, let's say, changed the meaning or perverted the meaning of the past?
I think that ever since the Renaissance, when you have the beginning of what we call historical consciousness, and understanding that that the present is not simply the continuation of what has gone on before, but there's a clear distinction between the present and the past. Ever since that point, different cultures have had different ways of looking at where they come from, the kind of weighing of its positive and its negative kind of qualities. And that's what I call that sense of the past has changed and it's altered. And very often the sense of the past was seen as in a very nostalgic way. People talked about the good old days. People sought to find refuge in what they thought was the past. Whereas today what's happened is that the phrase good old days has been replaced by the phrase bad old days. And there is an attempt to represent the past in an extremely negative manner, which is in a way that is quite unprecedented. So that when you look back on the past, it is seen as something that we really need to break away from, because the past, in a sense, from their point of view, continues to contaminate the present. It is toxic phenomenon that we need to quarantine. So everything that is associated with what's gone on beforehand, with our ancestors, with the history of the legacy of our civilization, has got to be somehow cut off from the present, so that people, escape from their influence. I mean, that's generally how it's seen, and that's often presented in very subtle ways. So if you look at parenting books, contemporary parenting books always tell you, the new parent, not to listen to your parents, because their advice is likely to be wrong. And particularly, don't listen to grandparents and even older individuals, because they just don't understand the latest scientific techniques about how to bring up a child. So basically what we're saying is that, we have got to reinvent the wheel at every single stage, and particularly regard the advice that older generation gives us with suspicion.
This is the outcome of what you describe in the book as this growing or intensification of change, or the acceleration of change that eventually led to an estrangement or a detachment from the past. At what point in history can we go back and start to see this acceleration of change start to have this effect on how we maybe distanced ourselves from the past or became detached from the past?
Well, you have to remember that the acceleration of change is a perception. It doesn't necessarily mean that things are changing as fast as we imagine. But I'm sure you read all these documents that begin with the sentence, "We live in an ever-changing world. The world is changing more rapidly than ever before." And we've been saying this for about 100 years. And the impression that's been created is that because change is so imminent and is so rapid, it means that it calls into question the facts, the truth, the ideas that were in place beforehand. So that people argue that by the time a child has grown up and finished school, everything that they learned in school will become irrelevant because of the changes that occurred. That's kind of an extreme version of this kind of argument. And therefore, you often find, particularly in the West, this idea that what we need is not the wisdom of the past, but to be flexible and to be able to react to what has gone on. We need skills rather than the knowledge that comes from beforehand. And that kind of sense of accelerated change, that change calls into question everything that we've known beforehand, is one aspect of the where we view the past, the negative view of the past. But that then kind of combined with the development of identity politics and the ideologies that are associated with it, the anti-Western turn of identity politics, means that that kind of sensibility becomes fused with this belief that the past is irrelevant. But now what happens is you not only argue that the past is irrelevant because of rapid change, you also argue that the past has become an obstacle to further development, and not just an obstacle, but it represents a danger to the future generation. And that's the new thing that comes out of this last 100 years of changing views about the past. Because 100 years ago, nobody argued that the past contaminates the present. You just argued that it's becoming irrelevant, whereas now it's in a big leap in that direction.
I highlighted the word paradoxical, I think, every time I came across it in the book, because that's one of the aspects of this, that the past is irrelevant, yet it's still used in certain ways. They will go back into the past to affirm a certain identity, or say that this identity existed in the past, or as you mentioned a moment ago, that there's still harm, or that what happened in the past can still harm us in the present, but yet we're detached from the past. That was something that I enjoyed throughout the book, how you kept articulating this paradox that's been happening.
Yes, I mean, the paradox is very interesting because on the one hand, you have the denunciation of the past and insisting that we have nothing to do with it, we cut ourselves off from the past. At the same time, you have this obsessiveness with settling scores with the past. And you have all these political groups, social, cultural groups, who are continually it's almost like they're colonizing the past. They kind of eroded the boundary between the present and the past, and they treat historical figures as if they are their peers. And while they're doing this, one of the things that comes out of this is that they're really interested in using the past to legitimize their own very fragile identities. I think this is clearest in the case of trans ideology, where trans ideology and trans activists are continually trying to what they call queer history. And through queer history, they're trying to discover trans people in the most unlikely places since the beginning of time. Because if they can prove that transgenderism was around, 4,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago, then basically they can claim that their behavior is normal and historically legitimated, and therefore it is totally wrong to suggest that their place in the world is a relatively new one. So there are many historical examples where they look at historical figures and they basically say that it's not true that that's a woman or that's a man. That person is gender fluid. You take someone like Queen Elizabeth, who is a very strong woman, and just because Queen Elizabeth is a very strong woman, happens to be single as well, it's suggested that it's highly likely that if she wasn't a lesbian, that she had to be gender fluid. It's out of the realm of possibility that she was heterosexual. And that's like they kind of reading history backwards and trying to almost like kind of interpret important historical figures through the prism of their desires and their experiences.
And at the same time, going back to historic figures, you mentioned that there's an interest in going back to foundational values and foundational figures like Aristotle, and showing how that the whole Western project, if you like, has been tainted or flawed from the very beginning, from Aristotle to Shakespeare. And you give a good example of Winston Churchill as well in the book that I couldn't believe when I read about what they wrote about him in his former home in, was it Chartwell?
I mean, it has to be that's what they do. And basically, they've gone back to ancient Greece, which is, by all accounts, the starting point for what's called a distinct Western civilization. Obviously, there are many ruptures and changes along the way. And they have to do two things with Greece. First of all, they have to undermine the moral authority of Greece, of Athens in particular, as the place where democracy more or less comes into being, and where philosophy comes into being, and proper reading comes into being. Proper intellectual scientific work really kicks off in Greece. They have to completely tame that by saying that the Greeks were bad people because they had slaves. Everybody had slaves in those days. Athenians were bad people because women were not equal to men. Well, there was no society that I know of, where women were equal to men, and so they kind of systematically undermine or try to undermine the value of and the contribution that the Greek philosophers and the Greek political scientists made at that time. And then they go for individuals. So Aristotle, who is arguably one of the most important, if not the most important philosopher, has just been attacked time and time again for his alleged racism. You look at what they say about Greek art, and increasingly they say that because most of Greek art was kind of constructed with kind of in a white color, so that many of the figures you see, the statues you see, are white. It is claimed that indicates that this was, a manifestation of white supremacy, that they were basically racializing, what they were doing in a completely weird way, not forgetting that, that the Greeks had no sense or idea what race was really all about. It's a concept that kicks in much, much later. So basically, if you're able to destroy the reputation of Greece, then what you've done is you've kind of undermined one of the important foundations on which the subsequent civilizational accomplishments rest, because without the Greeks there are no Romans, and without the Greeks and then Romans, then Europe itself becomes extremely becomes basically a semi-barbarian desert, that has no inherent merit.
Is that analogous to, say, the 1619 project, going back to the foundations of the United States and trying to rewrite that and show how the foundation wasn't in 1776. It was when the first slaves were brought to the American continent.
Yeah, I mean, the 1619 project is very interesting because that is a very self-conscious ideological project to call into question the foundation on which the United States rests. And it is important to realize that the founding documents, including the Declaration of Independence of the United States, were extremely ahead of their time. I mean, they were really interesting documents that raised very important questions about freedoms and about democracy. And they were quite central to giving the United States a very clear identity of who they were, how they were different from other societies. And that founding document has, hardly ever been questioned. But now, that founding document is seen as being a tainted, racist document. And at the same time, it's been suggested that America was founded in order to promote and in a sense, to kind of cultivate slavery rather than for any other reason. So if you can basically turn America's foundation into a story of oppression, greed, and slavery, that's the motive, rather than the desire for freedom and independence, then you essentially destroy the very identity of America. And that's what the 1619 project does. It self-consciously tries to deconstruct the American past as you understood it until now.
You mentioned how Nicole Hannah-Jones, the person who started this project with the New York Times, you cite in your book how she said, and this is a paraphrase because I can't remember the exact quote, that this is not a history. How do you analyze what she means by that? Because there's kind of a game being played there, isn't there?
The reason why she said that was because a number of prominent American historians called into question the facts in the first version of her argument, basically explaining how when the slaves arrived at Jamestown, or that wasn't the beginning of America, and they called into question the sequence of events in order to explain that actually the War of Independence in the United States was not about slavery, it was other motives that were behind it. So she couldn't really come back and defend her position as a historian, as an academic historian. So she had to then play the card that said, I'm actually a journalist rather than a historian. And what she's really saying is that there's a greater truth to the real truth. And the greater truth is that America is racist, has always been racist, and it's this kind of racist identity that transcends everything else that's important about the United States. So she's shifted the argument entirely towards this kind of story that she's constructed, and she's saying it's legitimate to construct this story that's got no factual basis because it kind of speaks to a higher truth for what is really wrong with the United States.
I'd like to get into education of children and identity and why intergenerational transmission of culture and history is important to have a sense of roots and identity. This, I thought, was a powerful part of the book and one that also tends to make one angry as well, that's about what's what's happening and how children are being educated today. What's the relationship between being estranged from our cultural past and identity crisis? And you also mentioned how terms like that, like identity and identity crisis, are quite recent as well.
I mean, I wrote a whole book about this before this book, but basically, the way that it works out is that historically, sort of the way you socialize young people to know their place in the world, is basically by transmitting the values of your community. That's the responsibility of adults to do that. But if the adult world ceases to see any value in its values and is almost embarrassed about transmitting its values, and if in addition the schools basically teach that the values of the past are inherently malevolent and bad, and we got to reject them altogether, then the question becomes, well, what do you socialize young people into if the adult world is no longer transmitting values and the inheritance of young people, their cultural, civilizational inheritance? What are the kids left with? And as it happens, the only thing that they're left with are basically teachers and schools who try to find a substitute. The substitute they usually find is psychological validation. So basically, you tell young people that your self-esteem is the most important thing in the world. We're not going to criticize you. We're going to validate you. It's almost like validation becomes the principal way in which you try to help kids make their way from being children to adolescents to adults. But the problem is that once young people are deprived of their inheritance, their kind of cultural inheritance, and really are unsure about their place in the world, where they come from, and have no pride in anything to do with their own community, then they themselves become a little bit disoriented. And they become disoriented to the point at which where it's almost like they're given the responsibility of cultivating their own identity because the adults have not done that job. So in the course of getting into the situation of having to cultivate your identity, what happens is you never get to the point at which you are got the kind of confidence and the belief in yourself that is essential for you to know who you are and what you're about. And I argue that, for example, the proliferation of mental health problems, the proliferation of young people who feel powerless to really make their way in the world, which is it's very strong in most parts of the West, is linked to this development because without the resources that they need to develop a strong identity, invariably, a kind of crisis sets in, which means that a lot of young people end up being childish, even in their 20s. And it leads to what I call the infantilization of society, where even young men, 25, 26, into their 30s, are still behaving like children rather than as kind of mature adults.
It's part of the book that I really enjoyed reading, and I enjoyed that perspective because it adds something to, I think, what Jonathan Haidt is doing with his work on social media and how that's affecting children. And a few months ago, I also talked to a social worker named Erica Commissar, who writes about attachment between children and their mothers, and how that has that bond and attachment has not been as strong as it has been in the past, and that's also leading to mental health problems like anxiety.
If you're interested in that question, I wrote this book called 100 Years of Identity Crisis. I wrote 2 or 3 years ago, which actually deals with the history, how identity as a concept is developed, how you have this mutation of concern with identity into crisis, and the different elements that kind of feed into that over the decades is a huge problem, because it essentially means that if you look at the last 40, 50 years, every generation feels a little bit powerless, more powerless than the one beforehand. And and all that school can end up doing or do is to indoctrinate young people into the values that they've invented, not the values that are rooted in a particular historical experience, but the kind of values that administratively are created. And a lot of that is basically values that are linked to identity politics, which is what young people are fed on in schools.
I have just one more question I'd like to ask you about the subtitle of the book and the project or think tank that you're a part of in Brussels. The subtitle of the book is Why the West Must Fight for Its History. I'd like to ask you some of your thoughts about how and why the West can fight for its history, and the project you're involved in Brussels, how you're engaged in that battle.
I mean, the reason I went to Brussels wasn't to run this think tank, wasn't because I needed a job, but I felt that it was really important to engage with the cultural conflict that is erupted all over the West, and particularly I was interested in what's happening in Europe, and I felt that it was very important that one was able to provide an intellectually sound, strong, narrative to the way that kind of culture is represented on a number of issues within the European landscape. And to me, it seems to be the case that because the Cultural War has been in existence more or less since the late 70s, and decade after decade, nobody has really responded to it. Decade after decade, people thought this would just go away. This is really crazy. Yeah. But instead of going away, it just got worse and worse and worse. And the most, we're now getting to the point where we're not just simply questioning the boundary between men and women and adults and children. We're not questioning the boundary between animals and humans. And people are talking about, can animals give consent to having sex with humans? So it's getting to the point now, and that's because they never had any kind of comeback. Most conservatives in particular just laughed. They thought it was funny, this would go away, or they came up with answers that were really not particularly sound or effective. So I felt that one of the things that needed to be done was to basically react to this, to respond to this in a way that is able to intellectually take apart this kind of narrative that is there, and in a sense go to war because they're fighting a war. They're absolutely committed to it, and there is no point in a one-sided battle, because then if that happens, then it will have, I think, civilizational consequences if we allow their values to prevail, and values that were, in a sense, integral to human progress over the centuries to be destroyed. I think they're in big trouble.
Yeah. The book we're discussing today is called The War Against the Past, Why the West Must Fight for Its History. It was just recently published in September, and it's now available. Thank you so much for your time today.
Talking to you, yes.